evening, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this, the first of our dialogue series events as a part of this, as a part of equalizing, on the topic of equalizing the role of women in policing, which is part of our broader project here at National Law School, looking at policing, women police, and gender. So just to, my colleague Devyani will take you through the dialogue series and the broader work that NLS is doing on the question of policing. But it's great to have so many of you logged in into this session and to participate in the first of these events. The National Law School has been doing multiple research initiatives on issues of both criminal justice, on policing, and on issues of gender. And it is great that we're going to today listen to an eminent speaker like Ms. Jane Townsley on questions of women in police. So without any further ado, I hand back over to my colleague Devyani Srivastava to take this forward, and we'll also be discussing the compendium on the question of policing and women in police. And so over to you, Devya.
Thank you so much. A very good evening to everyone, and thank you really for joining us this evening. Very briefly, I am currently leading a project that NLS is doing with the Karnataka State Police, which involves a study of issues and experiences that women are facing at different levels within the service. This study is underway right now and will be completed by April of 2023. As part of this sort of larger focus on policing and gender, we are pleased to initiate this dialogue series that focuses specifically on issues surrounding women in policing within gender. The goal really is to showcase and highlight research, initiatives, and programs that are aimed at promoting women in policing, both from India and from around the world. Over the past decade in India, there has been an increase in political and policy commitment towards increasing women's role in policing. In 2009, the government of India first adopted a target of 33% for women's representation in the police. Although some states like Maharashtra had brought in reservation earlier also, but post 2009 saw a jump in states adopting similar targets. Latest data shows that 14 states and 6 union territories in India have reservation of 30 to 33% for women. 5 other states have between 10 to 25%, while remaining 11 are yet to set targets. Karnataka, where we are based, has a target of 25%. Now, increasing women's representation in the police is considered important not only as a matter of women's rights, but equally for improving policing overall. This is for several reasons. More women in the police is seen to make police stations much more approachable, increase confidence of women in reporting crime, enhance a sense of safety in public places, improve the overall image of the police, and importantly, catalyze organizational changes towards a gender-sensitive police service. Recognition of these principles underpins reform in criminal law in India, beginning from 2009. These reforms specify and expand policing functions only women personnel are required to perform at different stages of the legal process. At NLS, we have produced an explainer note that provides a summary of these legal provisions. And as soon as I'm done speaking, I will share the link of the note in the chat for all of you to see. Meeting these statutory obligations requires governments and police departments to substantially increase women's representation at all levels. Though the share of women in the police has increased in India from about 4% in 2009 to 10% in 2021, the pace of change remains slow and uneven. There's considerable variation at the state level. Chandigarh as a union territory is highest at 22% representation, followed closely by Tamil Nadu at 19%. States like Bihar, Gujarat, and Maharashtra are around 15 to 17%. Whereas at the lower end, we have states like Meghalaya, Tripura, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh, which are between 5 to 6% in terms of women's representation. No state is close to the target of 33%, and this is a decade after the targets were set. In fact, a recent report by the Karnataka Administrative Reforms Commission has noted that it would take Karnataka more than 22 years for the percentage of representation to reach the level of 25%. This is assuming recruitment takes place every year with this target of 25%. This points to the need to expedite efforts to increase women's share at all levels. But as research has pointed out, and as we all know, numbers alone is not enough to meet the goals of diversity. Institutional measures that address operational difficulties women face are critical to make sure women not only join in larger numbers, but are able to participate meaningfully. The dialogue series is really designed to assist police departments in identifying successful measures that have had a positive impact or promising initiatives likely to bring sustained results or even persistent challenges to women's equitable growth. A series of such sessions will be organized through next year, so a sustained conversation can take place and can deepen shared understanding among all of us in support of women in policing. Our inaugural session today is on global practices that will highlight trends from around the world. Our first speaker is Ms. Roshni Kapoor, who will present snippets from a resource we are putting together at NLS. This is a compendium on institutional measures and policies undertaken by police departments around the world for strengthening women's representation and role in policing. The compendium will be released by March next year, but we thought it would be helpful to showcase some examples in the context of our discussion today. I'd like to now introduce Roshni Kapoor, who is a feminist researcher with close to a decade of experience in intersectional participatory research for policy and operational changes. She prefers the pronoun they. They have worked with UN Women, UNICEF, UNHCR, and IOM to lead research, development, and implementation of gender sensitization training with national and state level police and security forces across India and Bangladesh. I welcome Roshni to this discussion, and I thank her for accepting the invitation. Before I hand over to Roshni, just a few housekeeping announcements. The presentations, as you all know, will be recorded and made available on our website later on. We will take questions at the end of the session after both the presentations are over. Please type in your question in the chat box, and we'll try best to go through all of the questions at the end. And finally, I do request the speakers to stick to the allotted time so we can take more questions in the end. I'll give an alert 2 minutes before your time is scheduled to be up so that you can wind up. With those words, I welcome Roshni and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening and hello to people also not joining in the evening time zone. Thank you, Professor Meena. Thank you, Devyani, for not just sort of setting the context for all of this, but also because we've been working on this for many, many months. So thank you also for your guidance in this, in steering and helping sort of this project. So I'm just going to share my screen because it would be nice to not look at my face while I talk for the next 20 minutes. And also just it's easier with a lot of numbers that I might share. Just a thumbs up if you can see it. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so yes, so as Devyani set the context, this is part of a larger compendium, a resource that will be available later over the next couple of months. And we're just using this this time and this dialogue series to highlight a few of these examples, to really understand what are some of these good practices, what are some of the trends that are emerging globally. And this resource, again, will be made available and will be in the form of a very practical handbook. So that say if you're an implementation officer, whether you're in police, you're a policy or a researcher, and you're looking at, hey, I think we need to reform our, leave policy, or how do we look at flexible timing in our department, you could really open the chapter on, leave requirements, human resource policy, and go into that and see what has been done by other police services, so that you're not really sitting there reinventing the wheel. So that's sort of the aim of this compendium. And it's not being done in a vacuum. We would at this stage still wonder why are we still talking about the police? Why are we talking about women in police rather? Like we made great strides. But just to sort of take this slide, and these are some absolutely arbitrarily picked countries, but I wanted to give a mixture of so-called developed countries or countries from the global north. And we can see the numbers here. This is numbers from 2019 because not all data is available up to date. So just keeping that as the baseline. We're looking at 13 in USA, we're looking at 18 in Liberia, 23 in Germany, 33% in Sweden, 37% in Latvia. These are the number of women police officers, so women police officers in law enforcement agencies, not looking into account civilian women who might be part of some of these police departments, because that number usually tends to be higher. So just a very snapshot figure to see that we're really, even when we look at sort of, the argument that says that, women are half of the percentage, so where are women? Even among some of the leading countries like Sweden, they're only 1/3 of themselves there. And this is despite all of the resources, all of the national policies and efforts, all of the push. So it still becomes important to talk about this issue. Now, not all is bad, which is why we're talking about some of the good practices. There has been a monumental shift we can see both at policy as well as operation levels, where we see that the approach towards promoting women's participation has moved just from what they call, adding women and stirring it. So let's just get more women in, however that happens, at whatever level that happens. We've definitely seen a move away from putting women in and just increasing the numbers, just getting to gender balance, but actually to start looking at what would it look like to have a more gender sensitive police department. So not just that we're getting women in, because that's only step one. What happens at retention? Why don't we see more women take up leadership positions? What's happening there? Because even higher numbers like 33 in Sweden, the number of women in leadership positions is quite low. So it's not to say that, now we should completely stop adding women as long as 2 women make it to the top, but to see that this is all on a continuum. And step one is to ensure women get in. But there's an actual culture which is very gender discriminatory towards certain marginalized groups, the largest of them being women. And how do we address that? So this is also looking at some of these good practices. So, yes. So what do we mean by good practices? I think there was a little bit of a discussion when, a lot of times we say, oh, what are the best practices in the field? But I think we chose specifically the phrasing good practices, because at the end of the day, there is no best. We're addressing a monumental thing like gender inequality, like very restrictive gender roles, like huge institutions. And to both, by picking the phrase good practices, we wanted to emphasize that this is not a one-time effort. This will require a lot of continuous effort. It will also require joint effort. So it's not just all upon the police department to go ahead and make these changes, because often restrictive gender roles or discriminatory practices within the department is also reflective of what is the larger status of gender equality or women's empowerment in that community. And also to recognize that they not all have to be done at the same time. So all of the good practices we're sharing, it's not that it's a black and white or a 0 and 1 binary whether you do it or you don't do it. And as a department, to understand that these are just some of the practices that are over looking at many different. We looked at many different countries. We have captured 13 case studies, so 13 different countries, but we did definitely look at many more. But these are just good practices that we saw a pattern or a trend across these countries and said that, okay, these things seem to be working in more than one sort of specific site-specific, case study. So it's not just about resources or location or history of police reforms in this country. Despite all of that, or in spite all of that, these are some of the things that work. So what are some of these good practices? So on the columns that you will see these are the ones that we see across. So of course, the biggest being the sort of, the one that sort of initiates changes, which is national policies and plans. So this includes your legal infrastructure, what kind of, legal reforms are there, what kind of laws support that, whether that as we go into country case studies later, we'll see that, even initiatives like an Equal Pay Act has had a huge impact within police services, because the police department has gone back up to this law which looks at equal pay for women in public institutions and taken that as its lead and guide to then bring that as a reform towards making sure that there's making sure that there's equal pay amongst all levels of police departments. So national policies and plans are obviously the starting point. Where there is one, there's been an immediate sort of push towards making sure that changes, are sort of, we see the butterfly effect going all throughout, and police services being a very important public service institution definitely impact on that. So there's a very direct correlation. But again, not to say that because these big plans and policies don't exist at a national level, at a state or even at a department level, the rest of the changes can't happen. Again, what really helps is institutional prioritization. So this could look like goal setting or a quota, which we've seen, different states in India have done it, different countries have done it, and also a very strategic and concrete gender action plan. So when we're putting a goal in place to say 50%, we will see later on New Zealand has 50%, how do we get there? It's great to say a goal, but often when it is followed by an action plan, with sort of short-term targets, with follow-up action, this really leads to results. Rather than a commitment, whether that's a political commitment or a departmental level commitment, but often then just also how do we go about it? So having a priority, but also following it up with a plan. Again, gender quotas and targets, these targets being both for the entire department, but often we also see that even within women not being a homogeneous group, right? Even within women, which are categories of women that are lower, that have a lower representation. So in India, that could be your marginalized caste communities, that could be indigenous women. We see, again, to just take the example of New Zealand, because I spoke about it earlier, 50% quota for women or 50% target for women. Within that, they're looking at 25% of them to be Maori, 15% of them to be Asian, and 5% of them to be Pacific Islander communities. Again, because looking at who is not represented even within the women's category. So that's again important. Another one we've seen is this has been a big barrier. The physical recruitment criteria has been a big barrier towards entry. Again, building on very binary ideas of gender roles and what a physical type could look like, without recognizing that those criteria should be open to revision. But also maybe we do not need that kind of physical strength for very different roles within the police. So if you are within, say, a cybercrime investigation unit, you may not need the same kind of physical strength markers as those might be for, say, something that's much more, say, a riot control police, And even within that, these roles and these criteria often being defined by what is the male criteria there, In 1930s, male officers were required to jump this high. And if you cannot do that, you cannot pass. But can other male officers jump this high? I mean, this is also discriminatory. Oftentimes, we've seen in a lot of research that even male officers are like, yeah, well, we're not, working, our lifestyles don't look the same. So why don't we revise that? So revising and re-looking at some of these physical recruitment criteria. And following up with this is also then again, we're going to look at it later, is also to look at again, another sort of physical recruitment criteria, or, is also around uniforms. So I'll get into that later, revision of uniforms, gendered uniforms. Another good practice, and I'll only touch upon it because I know Jane has some really interesting points around women's networks and associations. And also, what gets called an association versus network. There's also an interesting, politics around the terminology and what's accepted. But this is one of the strongest patterns we've seen. So this is not to look at a women's union necessarily, but to say within the police departments where there is space and support for women's networks. Oftentimes we see women's networks are initiated by external support, so an external funding, whether that's in technical cooperation with an international body, or your National Women's Commission often takes the lead in sort of steering the process, bringing in experts on board. But over time, we also see, and we look into Bangladesh, where right now there is no external funding, but one of the criteria and one of the main sort of focus points for this network is to then how do we create an additional budget within police departments for sustaining this network. Again, as a space for peer-to-peer learning, for safe listening, for healing, for network building, for mentorship opportunities, which, for men, which they find outside, but often that's not the space for women police officers because they're also so few and far in between. This goes without saying, flexible, family-friendly work policies. So the debates are right now going around paternity leave. Should we offer it? How much should be paternity leave? Should we call it paternity and maternity leave? Should we call it care? Child care policy. I think this is universal across any institution where women do have more burden of childcare on them historically, irrespective of what community we come from. So how do we actually allow for this? How do we ensure that there is provisions within the human resource policy? And we will look at the example of United Kingdom, where there's actually very clearly coded definitions around that. I already spoke a lot about reframing gendered roles within police, but this point really speaking to a larger level police, and a reflection and sort of a self-reflection exercise within the department to really look at how do we look at police? When we look at an image of a police officer, when we put out a brochure, when young children in the street think of a police official, what is the gendered image that we have? Are we actually still stuck? And a lot of these policies and structures are reflective of how we within departments are also looking at these roles, and is there openness into shifting that? And the last to sort of, actually see if any of these good practices are working is to evaluate and assess. So in the compendium, we do share a lot of toolkits, for self-assessment to see where the department is right now, to evaluate it at a start level and also to come back to it, to use that as a recurring tool to come back to it. So looking at these themes, I want to pick a few of these and look at 5 countries. We've looked at a total of 13. I've picked 5 from different regions just to give us an idea of what these could look like in practice. How could these different things come together and what does that lead to? And, that'll immediately then follow on to Jane's presentation, who will sort of, speak more about that on-ground stuff. So looking at Bangladesh, again, a little bit, I've spent a lot of close to 4.5 years there, working very closely with women police. Bangladesh, right now, we're looking at 7% of police officers are women. However, Bangladesh, it's important to note, is the largest police troop contributing country to the United Nations peacekeeping forces, often going as part of the formed police unit, an all-women formed unit. So this is the highest in the world. The initiatives around gender-sensitive police reforms were really kicked in through 2006 when UNDP supported the police department in the police reform process. And you really saw that within that period where this program and technical cooperation was on, the number of women police officers jumped from, it was about 1.5 to 5%, which is a huge jump over a short-term period of about initial 5 years. Definitely would like to highlight the Bangladesh Police Women's Network. This is one of the sort of best or better practices out there of what a very organized women's network looks like. Extremely organized, has many councils and different divisional committee, has in 2021 also come up with a strategic plan with very clear goals and indications. And also, again, like I mentioned, a very strong emphasis on actually having a separate budget to continue the working of the network. And it's important to highlight this network because not only is it organized, but also the kind of support it's got both internally from the department, but also how, when you get that kind of support, when these networks get to thrive and get technical support and financial support, Bangladesh Police Women's Police Network has also been a role model for any other national level networks. When they're trying to see what to do, they often look at what's happening in Bangladesh. So that's a good point to highlight, that if we can make those reforms, we can actually become an international role model, not just improve policing within our state.
Roshni, we are nearing the end of time, so a couple of minutes.
Yes. New Zealand is about at 33%, sort of up at the board. This photograph is from the first all women's police station. This has also been revised. New Zealand has re-looked at its policy on all women police stations. We can discuss that when we get into the discussion on, whether that works, doesn't work. Again, interesting example from New Zealand to highlight is the New Zealand Police's Gender Pay Action Program from 2021, which very specifically not only sets out the goals that I talked about, goals of equity and gender balance, particularly promoting marginalized communities, indigenous communities, but also for promoting women in specialized units and ensuring that there is equal pay for women across all divisions, whether that's a specialized unit, on the field unit, at all operationals and leadership positions. So that's a really good practice as well, to ensure, to take that example of pay and see how we can push the equity agenda there. Philippines, one of the first countries in the ASEAN region to have a comprehensive program on women, peace and security. So they're sort of looking at it much largely, not just women police, but also looking at women in military because of their specific geopolitical, context. Here, again, a good example is looking at gender-sensitive uniforms and equipment. There's a huge police department's human resource manual that goes into very specific details around how even something as basic as police, uniforms and equipments and, workstations could look like in accommodating both different gendered roles, different body types, also changing body, including, around maternity or around sort of physical disabilities. How can equipments and, uniform address things like that? Again, a very good example in terms of looking at this, issue from a very intersectional lens. Then we get into South Africa. South Africa is interesting. 10% of women currently in the police. South Africa is, again, in its push towards promoting women in police, is looking at it again from a very intersectional lens of gender and racial justice. So initially there was a lot of push to get women in, but what they found that was very, very heavy towards white women, but in fact, you didn't see a lot of the different communities of South Africans being represented. So often issues, often policy, often advocacy messaging will look very similar in both, and will combine both of them. Last one, the last example for this slide, we have many more in the compendium, is looking at United Kingdom. Currently, 2021, we're looking at 34% women in police. What I'd really like to highlight is the National Police Chiefs diversity, equality, and inclusion strategy, which goes all the way up to 2025, which actually for the first time encourages a lot of self-assessment, lots of tools that we also share in the compendium that look at really doing a self-assessment, not looking at outside and saying, are we good enough like the other country or not, but saying, hey, within the department, can we really look at where we're at, where would we like to go, and then build a policy on that. So I'll wrap up there, Devyani, and then we can get into the details of that if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving a good overview of how things stand. I'd like to now invite Ms. Jane to share with us her experience. Ms. Townsley is a UN Women Senior Police expert, as well as the co-author of the UN Women Handbook on Gender Responsive Policing Services for Women and Girls subject to violence. Ms. Jane is a senior police officer retired with over 30 years policing experience in the UK. She retired in 2013 at the rank of Chief Inspector. Since retirement, she has established her consultancy specializing in capacity building for gender responsive policing and service delivery to local communities, as well as a focus on the empowerment of women in policing. We welcome Ms. Jane to the series, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. Now then, where to begin? I think what I'll do initially is just pick up on some of the points that were made by the previous speaker. And on behalf of the International Association of Women Police, I really welcome this compendium that is being put together. I'm not aware of any other global handbook of its kind. IAWP and UN Women did partner on the development of a global handbook on gender responsive police services to women and girls subject to violence. And there's a big focus on violence against women and girls, but throughout that handbook, there is also a lot of information and guidance on how police organizations at the very top, but also locally, can become more gender sensitive and gender responsive. But this compendium that's being put together, I think, will be a wonderful tool and something that the IAWP will be very keen to promote. Things have moved on. Many years ago, when I first joined policing in the UK, that was, things were very different to what they are now. I'd be surprised if this research had been done nearly 30 years ago, if the UK would have appeared as one of the good practice countries. There was a lot of direct discrimination going on in the UK, but also there was a lot of indirect discrimination, institutional sexism. And that's where your policies and your procedures do not take into account the specific needs of all of your workforce. We're focusing on women today, but it's been mentioned a couple of times that, you know, there are other groups, if you like. That intersectional approach is really important. So there's ethnicity as well as gender, but there's also disability, and some of those disabilities are unseen. You know, it's not always obvious. So there's a lot of different areas that policing now recognizes, but didn't at the time that I joined. So like many of you probably watching this, or you know of someone in your country, I was the only female on my operational shift, and there was only, I think, 3 of us at my station. So times could be very lonely. But I not only came up against people who really didn't think that we should have been in the police. Also, we were obstructed by the policies and the procedures that the police had in place. And that was a lot of that was down to there being no women in the decision-making, key strategic decision-making positions. So of course, all the decisions were being taken from the male perspective. And we heard about uniform and equipment. Glad to hear what's going on in the Philippines. I finished my career, 30 years of policing, and only in the last 6 to 12 months did I have a pair of uniform trousers that fitted me as a female. And throughout my time in the police, there were various battles that I fought to get specific equipment that suited met my needs as a female, but as a small female, and there were small males. But also, you know, I was being denied that level of protection and safety that some of my male colleagues had, merely because the equipment that I was provided with did not meet my needs. So again, all sorts of barriers. And so it's often what we find is that it's the women that drive the change, be that individuals who stand and are prepared to fight their corner, often at personal risk to themselves, and many that I know in my early career who stood up to being discriminated ended up leaving the police service on ill health grounds because of the stress and because of the way they were treated by the organizations. So the International Association has been in existence since 1915. But again, that was actually formed by a very insightful female officer. The British Association for Women in Policing, which is an affiliate of IAWP, that started when a female officer from the UK went to an IAWP conference in New York to receive an award, came back to the UK and said, wow, all these women gathered together, we need to do something. And so 5 women met in an officer's house. They brought in 2 male senior officers who they knew would support them, and the British Association for Women in Policing was born. And that's how many networks around the world have developed. But we've also heard that others are supported by donors and international partners because they recognize the power of networking. And I'll come back to that a bit later. So we heard about gender sensitive. So for me, gender sensitivity is around the sort of internal processes. Gender responsive policing for me is about internal. So you're responding to the different gender needs of your workforce, but it also is a huge partly external. So it's how the police are delivering their services to local communities. And are they meeting the needs of men and women, boys and girls? Because again, research tells us that, and many of us have experienced it, so we know that women and girls have different safety and security needs to men and boys. So police service delivery has to meet the needs of the whole community, and particularly if it's to build trust and confidence in those communities. Because without trust and confidence, lawlessness will grow, and we as the police have a much harder task in keeping the peace and keeping everybody safe and secure. So, and I was also really heartened to hear the mention of, you know, we share good practice, we all learn every day, but we don't necessarily take exactly what's happening in this police agency or in this community and implement it here, because it has to fit the context in which you are working and living. So one size does not fit all. And again, once this compendium is released, and you will see lots of good practice, you know, we mustn't try and do everything at once. I have a saying of, don't try to eat the elephant, which might be quite pertinent for India, because you have Indian elephants. You know, try perhaps an ear at a time, and then, you know, go for something else, because if you try to eat the elephant, you're more likely to fail from the start. I do have some views, and I hope we can have a good discussion on the use of quotas. I'm not a fan of quotas. I do appreciate that they have been successful in some areas, but from my experience, they can also be counterproductive. So if we are trying to change the culture of policing, we need to have an environment where women are appreciated for what they contribute to the service, they're respected, they're treated equally and with equity. Sometimes when we use quotas, it can actually cause more harm to those, certainly those pioneering women. I mean, certainly through my experience, and not just in my own country, you know, I've heard the saying, oh, well, yeah, but she only got that because she was a woman. Again, you know, it actually undermines what we're trying to do. I prefer the use of affirmative action or positive action. And I think whenever we use these methods, we need to be clear and communicate exactly what they are and why they're being used. Because again, people will misunderstand. And when I say people, a large majority of those people will be men, but also women. And you will find that, certainly from my experience, women in police might try and distance themselves because they think, oh no, I don't want to be seen to be getting anything special. But so positive action, I know, has been misinterpreted on occasions as being positive discrimination, and it's not the case. It's about getting the women or the minority individual to the starting line of the race, so at least they have a fair go at selection or whatever other option there is. We heard about policies and procedures and fitness tests. From my own experience, and again, this was the women's network in my country that championed and challenged the status quo. And so the fitness tests, certainly in UK policing or England and Wales policing, were changed. We use research, we got scientists involved, and they're now described as gender neutral. So rather than the test that I had to undertake, which was basically measuring my fitness against male characteristics, so the usual, the press-ups, running in a certain time, all these things based on male characteristics, they now do a much more generic fitness test that doesn't disadvantage women as much as it used to do. So that's one example. Another example would be, and I think it was touched on before, you know, tests for specific roles. So a motorcyclist, and this was applied to the men, but it meant that certainly women were probably never going to get into the motorcycle units. They had to, one of the part of the test was to lift a motorbike that had fallen over. Now, I know from my personal experience, I'm a motorcyclist, that, and so is my husband. My husband couldn't possibly pick up his motorbike on his own if it toppled over. So why on earth were these tests being put in place? So there's lots of examples and other examples that I can provide on uniform equipment, different selection tests. Well, one of the things that happened from my experience that made a huge difference within my country was the development of a gender agenda. And that was a long-term strategy for all police organisations. And it looked at 5 key aims. And that was developed again through the British Association of Women Police, again, network, what they can do. But it actually was broader than that. And it was launched in August 2001. And at that time, the number of women in policing in the UK was 16%. And now we've heard it's over 33%. So it took a lot of change, a lot of influencing change. But what that document did was not just highlight good practice, but it highlighted bad practice. And I actually heard a male chief officer say, for the first time, it's staring me in the face what we've been doing wrong. So sometimes we actually have to say, this is the outcome of what you've been doing. Really good to hear that Bangladesh is being quoted. I was lucky that in 2008, as first vice president of IAWP, I attended the launch of the Bangladesh Police Women's Network in Dhaka. And then in 2019, and they are an affiliate of IAWP. And then in 2019, I was brought in by UN Women to do some work to review their structure and their processes, and actually helped facilitate the development of the strategic plan that has been mentioned. It's very important to position associations or networks where they can actually be seen as a resource for the organization. So they're not there to be, as we've said, to just challenge for the sake of it, or say, women this and women that. They should be seen as an added benefit to the organization in helping the organization to become gender sensitive and gender responsive, and ultimately provide better services to local communities and build that trust and confidence. And that's where we positioned the Bangladesh Police Women's Network with their strategic plan. So they're now seen as, a resource that the Bangladesh police can now work with and utilize to improve policing as a whole. And the other benefits that comes from making change is often men benefit too. So in countries where flexible working policies, different opportunities, part-time working have been implemented, it's not just the women that benefit. Many men take up those options as well. From some of my experience in making change for uniforms, certainly specialist equipment like public order equipment, men have benefited too. So we all come in different shapes and sizes. And so, we can all work together. It was good as well. Oh, one thing I did want to mention on the figures for Bangladesh. What they have seen a big increase in is the women in the cadre, which is the higher level, the leadership entry point, where there's now 10.26%. So the women of Bangladesh, and many of those female leaders are in big key strategic decision-making positions, and they have been supported on their journey by the Bangladesh Police Women's Network. Good to hear about New Zealand, as our IAWP's annual conference is there next September. South Africa, the South African Police Women's Network has been an affiliate of IAWP. It's been a bit dormant, but it's now our second vice president. Leah Mofumi is the former Deputy National Commissioner of South Africa Police, and is working very hard to reinvigorate IAWP's presence there. Now, their network was very balanced in that it looked internally, but also it did a lot of work with women and girls in local communities. But the difference in South Africa is they also, alongside the creation of the Women's Network, they created a network for men called Men for Change. And men joined that who were supportive of the network and women's role in policing. And it sent out a real powerful message. So what I want to I'm just going to show you a few, get my teeth in, a few slides about the IAWP. mostly pictures, so you won't get too bored, I hope. And I'll also touch on the point that was made about the difference between the terminology association and networks. Now, the IAWP is an international association. Every one of us who are members are individual members, and we pay our membership. We're all volunteers. I was the president of IAWP for 6 years, and I was totally self-funding. So if I went to a conference, if I went to an event, so if I was there in person at this event, unless it was supported by an international organization or the hosts paid my expenses, then I paid myself. Unlike our colleagues in the International Association of Chiefs of Police, who have full-time staff and a big budget. So we sort of mirror what goes on in policing in that respect. But what I am aware of in some countries, and India is one of the countries that I've presented in, and understand that within either the constitution or laws, it talks about individual women have to have permission to be in an association. But when you dig into it, that is more where an association terminology means like a union, a police union, which is what we are not. So in those countries, and that's what Bangladesh called itself, a network, you know, we encourage to call themselves a network as opposed to an association, because sometimes that is more palatable for the laws within that country. But at the end of the day, our association is a network. So our mission is to strengthen, unite, and raise the capacity of women in policing internationally. And our vision is a world where police reflect the diversities of the communities they serve and human rights are protected. So we are a global professional organisation for women in policing. We've worked a lot with the UN police, encouraging women to participate. We have a number of affiliate organisations across the globe, Bangladesh, Ukraine, Trinidad and Tobago, several in the US. I think we've now got 5 in the UK. We have them in Africa. So nearly every sort of region and continent has affiliates with IAWP. We've got several in Ghana, in West Africa. Our board of directors, this is in Kosovo in 2020, just before the pandemic. And again, you know, those ladies sat around that table having formal meetings about, you know, what we want to achieve and how we're going to achieve, are all volunteers because they're passionate about making a difference. I was just trying to see if in that picture we could see, the bottom right, I don't know whether you can see, lady holding up the camera, that is the regional coordinator, Shamima Begum from Bangladesh. So she represents South and East Asia.
Jane, sorry to interrupt, but I think the slides are not, they're not moving. We can only see the first slide.
Oh. Well, that's a shame. Let me stop and start again. Hang on. Can you see any now?
We can see the PPT. The first slide is on.
Yeah.
You want to just do it, make it in full screen mode, and then.
It is full screen mode in mine. Wait a minute. Something is not going well. Let's see. Is that full screen mode now?
Not for us. Yes, not for us.
Oh, it is on my screen.
Maybe you can just sort of, yeah, just click individually on the slide as you're speaking instead of a slideshow.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, now we can see the slide that you clicked on.
Yeah, it's a shame it's not going to full screen. Anyway, so that was the mission and the vision.
Yeah.
We have a large affiliate in Abu Dhabi. The lady on the far right picture is a member of the Emirates Women Police Association. So they're our first Arabic. This was the picture of the board of directors. And as I said, bottom right corner, I'm just wondering if I can actually make my screen bigger. That helps. Is the lady from Bangladesh. In fact, she's the vice president of the Bangladesh Police Women's Network. These are just some pictures from conferences. So this would be Region 13, which is the whole Western Europe. These ladies are from Sweden. I'm just going to flick through some of these. Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we always have a good contingent. And the other thing that's important is we need to engage the men. So we don't just, in fact, we have male members within our organisation, and my husband is a life member. He's a retired police officer himself, because we need the support of our male colleagues. And this isn't about women versus men. This is about how can we all bring our own strengths and contributions to make the police service improve its delivery. This was a global summit on ending sexual violence in conflict that the International Association Police were invited to. And these were some of our members from Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republic of Srpska, and Ghana, who came to London for the event. I think these ladies are from the Netherlands. The other thing about networking is training. So the networks can develop training, can help support mentoring, helping their members to develop their professional skills. This is a session at one of our conferences, and I can recognize people there from Australia, from the US, Antigua and Barbuda is there. Who else have we got? UK. And as you can see, they're running it as a workshop. So it's not just a case of people standing and training. We want people to get engaged and work together to solve some of the issues. This is a different session where practical policing skills are being shared. And this picture is from a visit in 2012 to Dhaka in Bangladesh. And the board of directors of IWP attended Dhaka in March 2012, and we had our early board meeting. So there's a number of women from the board of directors in this picture. I am just in the middle there, in the front. My hair's a lot shorter in those days. And we marched through the center of Dhaka on International Women's Day, promoting, the issues faced by women and girls in the local community. And then on the bottom left of the picture in the sort of the brownish uniform is the current president of the Bangladesh Police Women's Network, Amina Begum, who is also a DIG. We've been to Abu Dhabi for regional training conferences. Networking is about sharing experiences across either your agency, your country, your region, or here internationally. These ladies are from Cambodia, and these are some of our Kenyan members. Nearly said Nigeria. So, bringing together women as part of a network is a really valuable tool, if you like, to bring about change. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not sure how much I have left, but I'm sure that.
Yeah, you have about 10 more minutes.
Okay. So, and I would urge you to think about how you might establish a network and the strength that they can bring. And yes, you may need some external support, but IAWP is here not only to support you in how to establish a network, but we can also provide guidance on where you might seek that external support within your particular country. We have, for example, one of our corporate members of the International Association of Women Police now is INL, which is the US State Department, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau. So, you know, there are access. We have good partnerships with UN Women, UNODC. So, you know, we have access to resources that we can bring together to help you. But I think the point was made earlier, certainly about the Bangladesh Police Women's Network, is that it's not always just about how well you do in your own country. You can be a beacon of change for others. I mentioned one of the officers at the Ending Sexual Violence in Conflict Summit from Republic of Srpska, Sanja Samanja. She's a former board member of IWP, and she established the Police Women's Network there, and she has been the president, and they're a very, very successful network. And she is often asked to go to different countries within the region to explain and help how other countries can establish a network. Ukraine, she came in 2017 with me to Ukraine when they were first thinking of establishing a network. And now there is the Ukraine Association for Women in Law Enforcement, an affiliate of IWP, and again, a very active and successful network. So, you know, I think I'm really looking forward to having some dialogue and discussion. It's difficult to sort of, you know, capture everything that I want to within the keynote. But I'll just leave you with a few thoughts, and some of my research, my personal research, has found that we know there's a requirement for more women in decision-making positions if we're ever going to bring about institutional change. But more female role models are required, both to inspire and encourage women within policing, but also inspire and encourage women and girls in communities. One example that I often cite is an all women's formed police unit. So the UN police was formed, I believe it might have been from India, but it went to Liberia some years ago now. And just by seeing that number of women in uniform in the streets, the number of women applying to become members of the Liberian National Police increased by 300%. And I think that is a real strong demonstration of the power of seeing women in uniform. I did some research in a rural area of Albania and spoke to some focus groups. I did a male and a female focus group, and they just got their first female district police commander ever. And what they said to me was, having women in leadership and command roles makes a difference for women and girls in the community. It changes their sense of self-esteem. It affects all of us. And what they said was that just by seeing her out and about in uniform made them feel safer. They also said when I spoke to them, she had only been there 3 months. They said they knew her name. They knew quite a lot about her. Her male predecessor had been in post 2 years and they didn't even know his name. He was never seen out of the police station. So again, we do things differently, and that brings with it benefits. But the research also tells us that when we have gender responsive policing, it provides increased trust and confidence of women within society, ensures women receive a professional service. As I've said, women feel more confident in their safety and security, but it also improves the status of women in society. But it also improves the trust and confidence of men in society. And I know that from speaking to men from local communities. So women police associations or networks, whatever you want to call them, can increase the pace of change by providing support and advocacy. We know from research there's a clear relationship between the status of women in policing and the status of women in society. But trust and confidence in the police is only going to increase within the community when increased numbers of women officers are visible. So if we go and do really well and recruit lots of women into the police, but they're all sat in offices or in police only, female only police stations, or they're not seen on the streets, that won't have that impact that we're looking for in building trust and confidence. They need to be seen, they need to be visible, they need to be patrolling, and they need to be representative in all units and divisions. Women, and this again is what research tells us, women officers are perceived as less corrupt. They bring improved governance and oversight to policing. And they can also, if you have increased numbers of women, you can have increased levels of community engagement. So I think, you know, the research certainly backs up the need for more women in policing, and currently the IWP are doing, or we're planning and we're doing work focusing on the United States, because you saw from one of the slides, the United States, well, it's between 12 and 13% of women in law enforcement. And yet the United States, certainly through the State Department, spend millions of dollars every year funding gender reform within policing in many countries around the world. So the IWP are now focusing on the police chiefs in the US who are trying to recruit more women. But over the last few years, because of all the issues they've had, community tensions and conflict, it's really difficult to recruit anybody in the US. And when the issues arose following the George Floyd incident, IAWP were quick to make the point, where are the women? Because we believe firmly that had the US had more women in policing, would some of these tensions and issues have occurred? They may have done, because it's not just down to who the makeup of the police, it's down to how they're trained and everything else. But I wanted to make the point that, you know, the developed countries, the wealthier countries, whatever you want to call them, still have a long way to go. And I think that's coming back to the compendium. That's why it's going to be a really valuable tool, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we're trying to achieve. So the IWP, going back to the US, we're organising a summit in March, bringing together as many police chiefs from the US, which will predominantly be men. But we're going to get some international speakers to come and share good practice with the US to see, you know, how perhaps that might help them to increase their numbers. So I'll stop there. But hopefully I'll be able to discuss more during the discussion section. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your patience with my technical slide difficulties.
Thank you so much. That was a great overview of a sense of what's happening in different parts of the world, and really different parts of the world. I want to sort of now throw open the floor for questions. Again, please type your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to go sequentially and cover as many as possible within the time frame. We do have about 40 to 45 minutes for discussions, so please feel free to type in your questions. And we'll also, when the question is typed, we'll ask you to unmute and speak. Yeah, so questions, please. Just to get the flow rolling, if I may use the position to ask you first. there are two sort of points that I would love to hear your views on, given what's happening in India. One is that the push to recruit more women right now, at least in India, is to a large extent, as I mentioned, because of the changes that have been brought in criminal procedure, which require women now to handle certain functions in policing. All of this is coming from a recognition of a lot of the reasons, like you've highlighted, that police needs to be more diverse. But the immediate trigger really has been those changes in law, as a result of which departments are recruiting more women. So the question is, so women are being recruited primarily to improve police response to gender violence and to crimes against women. There's a tendency, as you said, of it becoming counterproductive, of then responding to gender violence being seen only as a women's thing. There's a tendency to see it as a side policing thing, not a core policing thing. So this whole thing about what constitutes core policing, is playing out also because of this push to have women deal with gender violence. And so the question is, how does the leadership at this point of time take note of this tension that exists, and how does one plan the messaging around it? That was one question. The second was more, from your experience, now that UK has reached 33%, and research has shown once again that when women constitute about 25% and more is when they start. When they form a critical mass and are in a position to drive broader organizational changes. So pushing for a greater transparency in decision making, not just on gender issues, but broadly on policing issues. Now, you've brought in some of these examples in your presentation, but could you, perhaps elaborate on the changes that you see women driving in policing overall, in the style of policing? And also linking to what you mentioned about the US, whether things would have been this tense had there been more women. Is there evidence that is bearing out that women perhaps do subscribe to a less coercive style of policing? Is that bearing out on the ground from any part of the world, actually? So those are my two initial questions, and do encourage everyone to please use this opportunity to engage. Thank you. Jane, perhaps you could answer.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Right. So where do we begin? Right. Well, first of all, we must, the messaging needs to be clear and unequivocal. Certainly female victims of gender-based violence are more likely to want to speak to a female, but we should never be saying that only women should deal with it. Victim survivors must have a choice, and some, for whatever reason, may prefer to speak to a male officer. Also, just because you are a woman doesn't necessarily mean you're good at dealing with women and children, and just because you're a man doesn't mean that you're not. And that actually happened to me very early in my career. As I said, very few women, and a female was brought in for theft from a shop. We call it shoplifting, and she had a buggy with her with some young children. So she was brought to the police station, radio message, could I come to the mess room, the canteen, and could I look after the children while the female is interviewed? I got on the radio and said, why me? And of course, because you're the woman. And I said, I don't have children. I wouldn't know what to do with them. Why don't you ask PCX? He has 3 children. He adores children. And actually, the sergeant did exactly that. And he went into the station and looked after the children. So again, that's probably an extreme example, but it just goes to show that, we get gender bias and stereotype in whatever we do. Someone once said that increasing the number of women in policing is not about rights for women. It's about effectiveness for the organization. And again, we can cite examples from Afghanistan a while ago now, not recently, whereby the extremists were circumventing the security posts because the women in the Afghan police were all kept in the stations out the way. So what did the terrorists do? They dressed up as women in burqas. They couldn't be searched because there were no female officers on the ground, and so they were becoming suicide bombers at the checkpoints. You know, that's about operational effectiveness. Having females there is about operational effectiveness. Throughout my career, my own experience of dealing with conflict, and when I mean conflict, I mean local fights, you know, people getting upset with each other, is certainly early in my career. If I walked into a public house, you know, there's quite a lot of noise going on, then in those days, just by me walking in as a female used to diffuse the situation. That's not the same now, I have to say, in my country, unfortunately. But there is research, and I have witnessed it myself. Women approach things differently. So research tells us that women are less likely to use force. They're less likely to use the extreme levels of force, and that in itself produces less complaints against police. And again, that fairness, that trust and confidence in local policing. I'm sort of jumping around a little bit here. But I think the other point you made about not pigeonholing women into gender-based violence roles, as I said, from my experience throughout my career, there's been some fantastic male officers who have dealt with the whole range of gender-based violence, including involving women and girls. And they've done a tremendous job, but it's about having choice. The other point well made is that gender-based violence must be seen as core policing. I touched on earlier the global handbook that UN Women have created with the support of IWP. Throughout that handbook, we talk about the importance of policing violence against women and girls and gender-based violence, because it impacts on so many other crimes. And if we can get that crime right, or that service delivery to those victims right, we will build trust and confidence. We will get more community intelligence. We will get told where the crimes are being committed, who's committing them, where the stolen property, where the guns are being stored. That will come. And had in years gone by, had the role of those dealing with gender-based violence not been seen as the soft part of policing, it's not real policing. But actually, when you think of the types of skills, the types of work that entails, it entails building relationships with communities, building relationships with victims, with their families, and actually brings a lot of those skills that now places like the US are missing, and have all this community tension. So instead of sort of pushing gender-based violence to one side as if, oh, it's not real policing, it's a soft skills, we should actually be talking about it being essential skills. It's an essential part of core policing, and it should not be minimalized. But that means clear messaging from the very top. But it also means that the very top need to hold officers right the way down to be accountable for their actions. Because if we're not accountable, then again, that impacts trust and confidence. You talked about critical mass. Actually, in my sort of research and some of the research that I've relied on, certainly in the UK, we've always talked about the critical mass being 35%. We're almost there. What we do see, though, is the numbers in the strategic leadership roles goes up and comes down. It sort of goes like this a little bit. We've had a few lean years with a lack of female chief officers, but I think we could say the future is looking good. So we have seen women driving change. Just recently, or in the last few years, we actually had 3 of the most senior police posts in the UK were all led by women. So we had Cressida Dick was Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Dame Lynn Owens was head of the National Crime Agency. And we also had, we still have now, Lucy Dorsey is the Chief Constable of the British Transport Police, which is a national police service in the UK. So women are driving change. Certainly in my own force, I'm retired now, but I am seeing and hearing about great changes being made because they now have a female chief officer. So they're in that position to really make a difference. And I could name others over the years who have really pushed for change, not just in the UK, but in other countries as well. But again, it's about not just getting more women in, we've got to retain them. To retain them, we need to ensure that the environment and the culture is gender sensitive. We need to make sure that there are policies and procedures in place that don't disadvantage women. And we need to support them to thrive and reach their full potential. And that is really where networks and associations can really make a difference. I'm currently doing some work in Georgia to develop a network for the Ministry of Defence there and the police. And, you know, some of the sort of the work we've been doing in a recent workshop was highlighting how much strength just knowing that this network is being formed has given to those women that are often the lower in rank, deployed away from the main cities, so they're much more isolated from their colleagues. But just knowing that there is a network behind them that they can call on, make contact with, is a huge source of strength. So I'm not sure if I've actually answered what you said. I probably jumped about a bit, but hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight.
Yeah, they certainly were very useful pointers to dig deeper, to read. There is one question that we have right now from Yash Kumar. Yash, since there are not there are no more questions, then we don't have any other question. Why don't you unmute and introduce yourself and ask the question? Can I wait? I think I'll have to unmute you.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening. Please introduce yourself.
Ma'am, myself Yash Kumar. I am second year law student at Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University, New Delhi.
Okay.
Ma'am, my question is that is there any other way to raise the number of women police personnel in India except by providing them reservation in the services?
Thank you, Yash. Yeah. Jane, over to you.
I wasn't quite sure of the point of the question. Was it that, did you say reservation of the?
His question, I think, if I'm correct, is what are the other ways in which women numbers can be increased in police services without reservation? So if you don't actually have quotas, what are the other ways?
Oh, yeah, it was the quota. Yeah, it was the.
Yeah.
Well, there's an awful lot of examples from around the globe of how we can increase women's participation. It's not going to happen overnight, and I think it's very important that we analyze and assess what our criteria are for selection in the first place. Because if you actually go back to that and look at it, you might find that what we're expecting men and women to, fit into the criteria to become a police officer might be disproportionately disadvantaging women. So I go back to what I said very early on of some of the work that happened in the UK, and the entrance fitness test, for example, was changed and made a dramatic difference. The other thing is role models. If women and girls in the community see women in uniform, which comes back to the visibility, they then start to believe that they too could become a police officer and it could be a career of choice. Some of the longer term solutions are really around changing the institution and the culture. If we're ever going to increase the overall numbers of women, we must make sure that those that we recruit remain in the police. And that's sometimes the part that's missed. We hear lots of talk about increasing the recruitment of women. That's currently what's the focus is in the United States. But actually, if the environment is not right, if we haven't reviewed our policies, our processes, run an assessment to see if they are, we could do a gender assessment, then any women that we recruit are likely to just leave by the back door. Interestingly, my last police service that I was in, they had some really tough performance targets on the recruitment of women, and they were measuring the performance against how many women entered the service and attended training school. But what they hadn't done was look at the actual environment, the culture, the organization, to see A, if it was attractive to women, but B, if it was sensitive, gender sensitive and gender responsive. Because what was actually happening was our numbers, we were getting something like 30-40% of our new recruits were women, but our overall numbers were not changing. So actually we, as I say, the women's network within the organization, started to look at the attrition rate. And the attrition rate for women was larger, or was certainly larger than our overall numbers. So that's what you need to focus on. Why are they leaving? Because you can get a lot through the front door, but if they just open the back door and leave, you're no further forward. So there's a lot of work that can be done around culture, about raising awareness of both men and women within the organization. So I think with quotas, the danger, as I said, with quotas is that they can be counterproductive. That being said, it does work if it's managed correctly, but the messaging needs to be very clear. I prefer the positive action. So, for example, if we wanted more women in a specialist firearms team, for example. But they weren't applying because their perception was it's very male, it's all very masculine and, testosterone, and why would we want to be part of that? So we would run what we call positive action events. So we would actually invite women officers in. We'd have the weapons out. We'd let them, fire weapon. We'd actually have women that were working within the department come along to the sessions, and we'd actually talk with them about, what it's like, what the reality of the role is about. Again, if you want to recruit more women into policing, you can be proactive about where you advertise, where you recruit from. Think about it. Where do women generally just congregate? So certainly from my own experience in my own country, back in the sort of 90s, when they were really looking to increase the number of women, they were actually they made sure that the promotional material was gender sensitive. It wasn't all about the sort of strength, power, force, which is a very male characteristic. We also targeted recruitment through women's magazines, supermarkets, generally, where, you know, you're more likely to see more women in a supermarket than men. And again, you know, you have to work smarter. But again, affirmative action, for me, that's where you would have 2 applicants for a job, be it a police recruit or a specialist or a promotion. You have 2 applicants, one's male, one's female. Both meet the criteria, both exactly the same qualified, nothing at all to a split between them. But that's where you would take the female if you have less of that particular group within the organization. So it could be that if you're looking to improve the ethnicity or the racial profile of an organization, if you have less of one particular group, and again, that same thing applies, they're equal, absolutely equal in standing, affirmative action would say that you would take the person from the minority group. And that's deemed to be legal, certainly in a lot of countries. So yeah, it can work, but it needs to be managed carefully. I'm not saying that, you know, quotas in different countries haven't worked at all. I just, from my experience, prefer not to use. It might even be around using of the term quota, because it implies that you've got a place because you are from a certain group, as opposed to the skills. And I think as long as the messaging is clear that you're not lowering standards, you're not making any other changes across the board, but you are, as you've actually put it, really reserved so many places for this particular group, then I think it can be managed and can work. But I would urge going the other way, because even using quotas, as I've said before, you could get a big batch of women in, but if you don't do the rest of the changes, they're going to leave anyway. So I hope that might have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Can I ask a question while we're here?
Yeah, Roshni, please go ahead. And we've got another question from Komal. So Roshni, please go ahead with yours, and then we'll go to Komal.
I guess, yeah. Less a question, more an invitation for Jane to maybe share more, just because there's such a wealth of experience. I want to go back to what you started with, Jane, when you were talking about indirect sexism, or rather, how is it indirectly within police organizations that women feel often discriminated? Because I think because I think this is a good space to talk about that, and also just it links up very well to what you had also shared about then, you know, beyond, because targets or quotas or policies are always external. You know, you could almost kind of fudge if you had done it or not, you know, but actually it's how do you change the stuff that's inside. So maybe if you could highlight from your own experience or what you have, you know, gathered from research, how do these ways that discrimination and sexism works in rather insidious ways, and then what are those things within departments that actually really address that, you know, which could be small on paper but actually could have some really strong you know, change.
Okay, I was recently doing a baseline assessment in a country who are looking to you know, increase the number of women, and talking to one of the most senior females in this organization. She was talking about the lack of, they call them career courses. So you've got to do so many of these to be able to enhance and get promotion. And she said that within the unit department that she was deployed in, they didn't do career courses. But she said, but they don't do it for the men either, so it's not discriminatory. So I asked the question, what's the proportion of women in that unit compared to the men? And the bulk of the staff are women. So there you have a classic, potentially indirect discrimination that, you know, if it's disproportionately affecting, if a policy decision or a procedure is disproportionately disadvantaging women or men, I mean, it could the reverse could happen, then you potentially have indirect discrimination. And it's one that's a lot less understood, and it's more, it very often institutional. So as I said, in my early career, the direct discrimination, that's obvious to so many people, and they will, you know, be up in uproar. No, we can't have that. But what's not so evident to people is the indirect, and that is often mainly policies and procedures, but it can just be decisions that individuals take. So again, it's very important to raise everybody's awareness on issues. And certainly through my career, I have been managed and supervised by some female officers who have been dreadful in the lack of support of other women, almost that I've got where I am the hard way, so you do it on your own. That sort of attitude, not wanting to share their experience and lift others up. But I think really the main changes around indirect discrimination come about when organizations or managers and leaders actually look in on themselves. That self-assessment, that self-awareness. So whether it's an individual or an organization, you know, and even those that are considered to be doing well, we know that we always learn, and that holding up the mirror, self-reflection, okay, what can we do better? How can we always continue to improve? Because the other issue is, you know, the role of women in society and women in policing in my country 30 years ago is completely different to what it is now. So we all change, we all develop. Policing has to change. So we need to continually monitor and evaluate what we're doing, the services we're delivering, and are they still fit for purpose in the context in which we're working. It's a bit of a wishy-washy response to the indirect. But yeah, I think indirect discrimination is one where you really need those sort of actual practical examples for people to sort of say, oh, that's what. And off the top of my head, I'm a bit rusty on the examples, but yeah, that was the most recent one. When the individual herself didn't realize that actually she could be the victim of indirect discrimination. And I can't remember what the other thing was you were asking me now. Sorry, I started coughing.
I think you covered her question. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Koman, let me unmute you. Please go ahead and introduce yourself. Just 1 second. Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Ma'am, so I want to ask that firstly, should you not
Komal,
think
sorry,
that-
just introduce yourself, please.
Yes. So myself, Komal, I'm from RGNUL Punjab University. So
Okay.
first year
Okay.
student.
Hmm.
So I want to ask that firstly, the women should should be brought at par in all the nations, and then only we can talk about recruiting more women in the police. Like the situation that is now in Iran or the Middle East is like not favorable for them to be recruiting in the police, or because the police or the arms of the state are their main rivals right now. So it should be firstly that the women should be brought at par in all the nations, and then only on an international front there should be something like cooperation or something like recruitment. So should it not be the priority first to bring the gender inequality out of the frame, of- or like that? So I want to know the views like that. Thank you.
Wow, you've got some really big aspirations. And I think if we could solve gender equality across the globe, who knows what conflicts we wouldn't have. I suppose the danger of doing that first is, are we actually ever going to achieve it? So then go backwards, will we ever get more women in policing? It is a difficult one in certain countries, and certainly Afghanistan prior to the Taliban taking over had done quite a lot of work about increasing the number of women in policing. Still had a long way to go, and some of the women that were in policing were treated horrendously, and the IWP tried to support them where we could. And I was actually asked a similar question at a UN Women event in New York some years ago, when we were talking about the women in police in Afghanistan, and an activist sort of challenged me and said, how can you be putting these women at risk for the reasons you've just said? They go in, they're going to get raped, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, yeah, it is going to be difficult for those pioneering women. But actually, until you start getting more women in any organization, you're never going to make change, because all the decisions will continue to be made from the male perspective. Certainly through my career, early on when I first joined as a female officer, I thought, oh, things are never going to change. Luckily for me, I did rise up through the ranks, so I was able to implement change because I started to get the status where I could do that. But it can be disheartening, and if we don't try to push the boundaries, stand up and be counted is another way of looking at it, then how can we make change? Some of the Middle Eastern countries, so I mentioned earlier that we have a very strong network, an association, the Emirates Women Police Association, which is an affiliate of IWP. Now, they were formed in 2011. They're still going strong, but they are, and over time, you can see from the evidence within the Emirates, United Arab Emirates, how the status of women in policing is strengthening. They are getting some really key positions. They are being taken more seriously. They are being deployed into a whole range of roles now. So it's slow progress, but it's making progress. And now our 2025 IWP conference, the annual global conference, is actually going to be hosted in Abu Dhabi. So the first time ever in the Middle East. And it helps send strong messages out to others in the region. I think, we could say it's too difficult because of what's happening in some countries. And that almost gives organizations, gives police agencies and governments a get out clause. It's too difficult. We can't go challenge what's happening. We don't want to recruit more women into the police in certain countries because look at the way they treat women. But we actually have, cases within the countries that we have represented during this webinar, including my own, of how women are treated within parts of the local community and even by the police organisations themselves. So again, we need more women in police to help protect the women in the community. It is difficult, it is challenging, and it's very challenging for those women who are going to take that lonely step forward, and hence why they really need the support of networks and associations. The Ukraine Association of Women in Law Enforcement has a very strong motto, and it says, individually strong, powerful together. And for me, that sums up what networks and associations of women can do. So it's not the individual female officer challenging the system, it's the network can challenge the system, so it puts the other officers less at risk. I hope that has in some way answered your question. In an ideal world, it would be great if we just get equality right across the globe, but to be perfectly honest, is that going to happen? You know, we still see a lot of the peacemaking and conflict resolution being taken in some of these countries is only being taken by men. So I think, you know, we have to sort of work with the context, work very carefully with the context, but I think we should still be striving for more women in policing.
Thank you for that. We have about 10 more minutes, so I'll invite any last questions or comments anybody would like to share. Please just raise your hands. If there are any women officers, you know, who would like to share anything, please do come forward. Yash, are you raising your hand again, or is that from the earlier time?
Ma'am, I'm raising it again. I have some little bit question. I have one little bit.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is that, ma'am, how do you see the condition of women after, like, whenever the Ukraine and Russian conflict will over, and why United Nations is not intervening between the Ukraine and Russian conflict to save the women and children in that place, and also the UN is not very much active on Iran issue.
Yash, do you want to just sort of narrow down that question?
Yeah, I can't really talk about, you know, I'm not of the level that can really get into why the United Nations Security Council. I mean, that's political, you know, by who is on the council and what they believe. What I can say is that another really strong message about the power of networks and associations is that the Ukraine Association of Women in Law Enforcement has maintained its presence, is continuing, and IAWP are continuing to support them, supporting the women officers that are around Ukraine on the front line. We've just recently been helping them identify female specific ballistic body armor. Obviously there's a need there, but they've also been coordinating and supporting humanitarian relief for women and children, but particularly the families of police officers. So male and female officers who are often long times away from home, they've been supporting their families. And certainly early on in the conflict, with IAWP support, many families of police officers were removed from Ukraine to safety in other countries, where they are being supported and looked after by police families in other countries. The association has recently had a meeting, sort of not a conference, but a day together again, and they are determined to remain strong. And I think, you know, we cannot underestimate that, as I said before, the power of knowing that there are people around your country, but also around the world, who are there to support you. I mean, I had a message from one of the Ukrainian police officers only yesterday. So again, you know, it's about providing them with that strength, letting them know that we're there, we'll do what we can to support them. But as far as the politics are involved, I can't really talk much about I have my own personal views on the UN Security Council, but I'm not here really to talk about my personal views on that. So, you know, it is a challenge, and it will remain a challenge in many countries, unfortunately. Just quickly though, in Ukraine, I know from my work that I do with UN Women, there's a lot of support in the country at the moment from different UN agencies. So.
Thank you. Maya has put in a comment. Maya, please, may I request you to come on and speak a bit? I'm just going to unmute you. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thank you for all your inputs, Ms. Townsley. And the speaker before you, I think Ms. Kapoor, was it?
That's
really,
right. Yeah.
really interesting, and I'm so glad I spent some time here. I wasn't expecting to speak. I just wanted to say the comment I put in was because we were working with a police chief once long ago, and I remember his words so clearly. He said, "Women don't need policing. It is policing that needs women." And I really do agree with what Ms. Townsley said about how having women in changes the atmospheric within and the response both to the community and of the community to the police. But one thing I also wanted to mention, just because of the last two questions of the speakers here, is that you must also ask the opposite question of the situation as it is now. Why has it taken 3 decades to go, 4 decades more, to go from 3% in India to 10%? Is this something that we have to congratulate ourselves for? Or is it something that is indicative of the heavy bias, the resistance, the institutional unpreparedness, and a signal of the general inequality and inequity that women have to face? Is policing just a microcosm? You can make as many excuses as you like about policing not being a suitable profession or a dangerous one, or one within which women cannot be protected. Cannot be protected from whom? From the force? Or from the public? Or from whom? I think these counter questions are more important to talk about rather than adopting the narrative that says we have to wait for some circumstance before we seek to be prevented from obtaining all that is ours by right, which is equality. Even your 33%, in my view, that we have in the legislatures of different states, etc., is just a negotiation. It's just a sort of everybody getting exhausted and accepting that it'd be 33%. Why? Why shouldn't it be 60%? Why shouldn't it be 51%? Why shouldn't it be parity? Why? Don't get stuck with the narrative, which in itself is indicative of compromise and inequality. Sorry, that's more than I needed to say, Devyani.
No, that's Maya, please introduce yourself, because I think just for everybody.
When you please do all the things.
Maya is currently the editor of India Justice Report, which is a report that looks at key in criminal justice institutions in India, including the police. It evaluates the capacity of these institutions and ranks states in India against the standards that they have set for themselves. That is her immediate designation, but she's been the director of Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, which she founded in India, which is one of the leading a research organization looking at criminal justice issues, and she's a trained barrister. That's a very brief introduction.
It's more than I remember.
Well, I just agreed with everything you said, because we shouldn't there shouldn't be a need to be saying we've got to aim for this number or that number. We should be recruiting in policing those with the right skills and the best skills, but we should be representative of the communities we serve, whatever that looks like. And your point about the percentage in India and sort of almost mirroring the inequalities within Indian society, that goes back to certainly my findings in my research, that the status of women in policing is relevant to the status of women in society, and vice versa. You can look at it from either angle, but how women are treated in society will give you a measure of how they're often treated in the policing. And if we start to treat women better in policing, that can have a positive impact on women in society as well. So, but for me, both are interlinked.
Okay, thank you, Amaya, for those comments. We are at the end of our time, so it's we would I'll hand over to Professor Satish to conclude. But before that, just a quick note of thank you to particularly the officers from Delhi, Karnataka, Kerala that reached out to join this, and who reached out to join this webinar. We look forward to staying in touch with you, and also thanks to our funder, Hans Seidel Foundation, that is supporting this research at NLS. Over to you, Professor Satish.
Thanks a lot, Devyani, and it was wonderful listening to both the speakers. And so I'd like to thank both Speaker Pool and Steve for their comments, and everyone else who participated, and we've had all of them being here throughout the last 2 hours as this session went on. So thank you for being a good audience and patiently listening to the wonderful comments that were made. And on behalf of the National Law School, I hope you join us in future dialogues as well. And more details will be up on our website as these dialogue series continues. And look forward to seeing you again in the next webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening and goodbye.
Thank you.